Hello, my name is Ryan. I'm a member of the Chef Nice to Go forum, and this video is intended as a response to a recurrent series of questions regarding getting started sharpening. And the goal of this video is to cover kind of bare bones introductory information so that you can acquire a stone, get started sharpening your knives, and start to build kind of the lexicon and the experience base so that you can start asking questions to become a better sharpener down the road. So to start with, we need a little bit of knife anatomy, not a whole lot. The very edge of this knife has a bevel. It's the bevel right at the edge of the knife. It's the bevel that forms ultimately the edge itself of this knife. It is not this larger aesthetic grind here, but the very thin, shiny edge right at the edge. The bevel is typically called the bevel. Some people use terminology like primary or secondary bevel, but there's not a lot of agreement about which one's primary, i.e. this one or this bigger one here or this smaller one down here. And so just for clarity's sake, we'll call it the edge bevel. And so if you were to draw a little kind of caricature of a knife, it might look something like this, and you would have a little tiny bevel right here. Now this is where all the business of sharpening is done. And what we will be doing is using abrasives to remove steel off of this bevel and expose a fresh edge that can be used for cutting. If we were to turn this knife this way and take a cross section of it and look at the bevel, the edge bevel, on a dull knife, it might look something like this, where a point is not formed. This has been eroded away or chipped out or damaged. And so the purpose of sharpening is to remove steel from either side from the bevel and expose a fresh and sharp pointed edge at the apex. Now, there are basically two phases of the sharpening process. Again, at an introductory level, there's going to be two kind of processes we're doing to try to go from this dull edge to this sharp edge in the middle. Okay? And the first is the removal of this steel. As we do that, this shape will emerge with a tip formed, again called the apex. And at the apex, what's going to happen is the formation of what's called a burr or a wire edge. There's a number of different terms. And basically the steel, a leaf of steel is formed that will kind of typically fold to one side or the other. Typically, say we were grinding on this side most recently, the burr will angle away from the side we were most recently grinding on. And so the second phase, if the first phase is steel removal to expose this apex, this fresh apex, the second phase is removal of this burr. The burr can feel sharp to the touch, but the problem with the burr is it's extremely weak, and so it will mechanically tend to break off and fail, leaving, again, an unsharp edge. And so the burr can kind of be a false edge that can lead us to believe that that we have effectively sharpened our knife. And so, like I said, there are two phases. The initial is to expose a fresh apex. The secondary phase is the deburring phase. And so these are the two operations we're going to complete. So let's move on to sharpening stones. Now, broadly speaking, there's an awful lot of information that can go into stones, and they're hugely, preference in stones and stone characteristics is very contentious. It's very personal. A lot of people have their favorite stones. And so there isn't one answer to that question. Ultimately, the best thing to suggest is that you get a stone and you try a stone and see what does or doesn't appeal to you, and that can start to inform what your next stone acquisition might be. Broadly speaking, however, there are two categories that it's useful to understand the distinction between, and that is a splash and go stone and a soaker. This is a Sharpening Pro 5000 grit stone. This is probably the most popular recommendation for starters, not the 5000 in particular, but the Sharpening Pro brand. And this is a splash and go stone, meaning in order for this stone to be ready, all we need is to apply a bit of water to the surface, and this stone is ready to do work. This stone, on the other hand, is a Suhiro Rika 5000, same grit rating, but this is a soaker. And this requires only a couple minutes. This requires probably 4 or 5 minutes to be immersed in water to be ready to use. Both are used wet. The question is, how long do they need to be wet before you can use them? In general, for beginners, we tend to point people towards the splash and go just because planning ahead, kind of the added step of soaking, it can be a bit of a gumption suck for somebody new to sharpening. But nonetheless, both are out there. This is one broad category or broad type of distinction between different stones that it is probably useful to understand. Today, just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use the Suhiro Rika, which has already been soaking for several minutes. Now, as this is a beginning video, we are not going to discuss things like forming new edge geometries. That is to say, we're not going to really talk about altering the shape of the edge, whether it's, say, a 20-degree bevel on each side so that you have 20 degrees on each side and changing that to a different one. The best way to get started is to simply try to match the geometry that already exists on the edge. And the best way to do that, and you're probably not going to be able to see this on the video, is simply to take a Sharpie and color that edge bevel and then apply it to the stone and do a couple of passes. And then inspect to see whether or not the entirety of that mark has been removed. If that mark hasn't been removed, and say, for example, there's ink left towards the edge, then you're laid over too far and your angle is too flat. That's a really great way to basically try to emulate the existing edge bevel. Again, it is possible using all these same tools and techniques to alter this geometry, but that's not really going to be covered here. So once we are ready to sharpen, we get our soaked stone out, or we splash our splash and go stone out. We lay our edge bevel such that the edge is making contact with the stone, and we have one of two broad categories of techniques we can use. One is sweeps, in which we take the entire blade and we draw it in a continuous sweep from heel to tip, in a simple back and forth motion. Now, going back to our first step of metal removal, where our edge looks like this, we are removing slices with each pass. And our goal is to eventually get to a fresh edge. However, we would like to do this by equally removing steel from either side. So what we are going to do is do several passes on one side, followed by a roughly equal number of passes on the other side. You can count strokes and maintain an equal number of strokes on either side, or you can also simply visually inspect the edge to confirm that you are keeping each bevel roughly similar in dimension. The alternative to full sweeping strokes is sectional sharpening, in which case you will simply keep the knife in one place and work on one section at a time, shifting the knife periodically to work on the next section. This is easier to keep the knife in a consistent position without rotating this way. The problem, of course, is keeping it consistent from heel to tip at the same angle, as you might be inclined to alter your angle from here to here. So the sweeps are going to do better at keeping a nice continuous angle from heel to tip, whereas this will be more likely to probably keep you consistent in the course of the stroke. Now, as we approach, or rather when we acquire a new edge bevel, when we've accomplished a new edge bevel, burr formation will be how we detect that new apex. And the way we're going to do that, remembering that the burr forms on the opposite side of the side we are grinding. So we will complete some series of strokes. Again, we're either counting or we're just estimating roughly equal grinds on either side. We will feel for a burr. We may feel a burr in one place or another and not elsewhere. The burr will feel, well, it'll feel like a sharp, it'll feel like a ribbon of metal on one side of the edge. Our goal is to have consistent burr formation along the entire length of the blade. It may be that one part of the blade was more dull than the other one to begin with, in which case we may get burr formation here before we get it here. Continue going with, say, 5 to 10 strokes per side, checking intermittently for burr, until you have burr formation along the entire length of the blade. Once you have burr formation along the entire length of the blade, we move into the second phase where removing the burr becomes the goal. We now have an edge, but it is obscured by a burr which will mechanically fail if we do not remove it. The way we're going to remove it is by doing alternating strokes, one at a time, in each direction. Light pressure here is ideal because we are basically, the less aggressively we're grinding, the less apt we are to form a burr, or the smaller the burr we will form. Once you have completed this process and can't detect using touch the burr, we're basically done. We now have a sharpened knife. We can do one of two things now. The next would be to move to the next finer grit stone. It's our recommendation at this point that for beginning sharpeners that you use a single stone, to purchase and practice with a single stone, developing a burr, and then eliminating the burr with one stone. What grit stone you need to get depends on how damaged the edge is to begin with. If you are able to visibly see damage to the edge with the naked eye, then you need a coarse grit stone coarser than 1000 grit. If, on the other hand, your edge is dull and performs poorly, say going through a tomato or an onion, but you cannot see edge damage, then you can start in something more like a 1000 grit range. For most people who are practiced sharpening, the beginning of a progression is about a 1000 grit stone. So this will kind of be the cornerstone, no pun intended, of most sharpening progressions. It is imperative that a cutting edge is established with the coarsest stone. If your edge is not sharp at whatever your after the use of your first stone, each successive stone will do nothing more than to make this edge bevel shinier without making the edge any sharper. A final stop for any progression would be a strop. A strop is basically, it behaves somewhat similarly to a very fine grit stone in that it is capable of removing some residual burr, but it's not so aggressive as to typically form any new burr. So it's a great place to finish any sharpening procedure. Unlike a stone, a strop is usually a soft material. This is leather glued to a piece of wood. You do not want to cut into it because the blade will easily cut into the leather. You'll use simply an edge trailing stroke at precisely the same angle as what you use to grind the bevel on the stone. This can also be used as a touch-up between sharpenings. I use this strop before every prep session that I use, well, any knife. This is a procedure I do every time I use a knife. So it's both a maintenance tool and a final sharpening tool. Strops can look like an awful lot of things. This is one I purchased from Chef Nice to Go. This is a piece of scrap leather, like I said, glued to a piece of wood. This is a piece of balsa wood. I have two diamond abrasive sprays applied to this. One is a 1 micron spray and the other is a 0.5 micron spray. So strops can look like an awful lot of things. And again, their roles are pretty much all the same. Now, one other point to consider is stone maintenance. The stones themselves abrade away as they wear steel away. Part of why water stones are effective is because the top layer of stone material is constantly being removed and exposing fresh abrasive underneath. But as a consequence, you will tend to get wear, excess wear in the center of the stone relative to the ends of the stone, and the stone will cease to be flat. Once this happens, it becomes very difficult to keep this edge bevel accurately ground as you work on a stone if that stone is not flat. So the typical way to maintain a stone is using just a pencil. You'll draw out a hash line, just some sort of hash pattern. And this is a Atoma 140 diamond plate. And the diamond plate is trued and it's abrasive enough to abrade away the stone. And because it's trued, it will reestablish a flat surface. And so this is called lapping. This is the most common way to do it, or at least it's the most common among people who do this often. Another procedure you can do to accomplish the same thing on a budget is to use sandpaper on something like a granite countertop so that it provides a flat surface, and then the stone will just be abraded away on the sandpaper. If you do this frequently enough and long enough, sandpaper can become not cost prohibitive precisely, but it can actually exceed the cost of a diamond plate. So for a beginner, if you are interested in a beginner kit, first of all, you need a knife. Second, you need a sharpening stone that is abrasive enough to remove the worst damage on your edge currently. This knife was quite sharp when I started with it, so I started with a 5,000 grit stone. But again, a typical starting point for a knife in good condition is 1,000 grit, and for a knife with visible damage will be coarser than 1,000. If your knives have excessive wear and tear, it would be advisable to get something in the 300 grit to 600 grit range to begin with. So a single stone, appropriate for the condition of your blade, some sort of lapping device, whether it be a diamond plate or you can also get a flattened reference surface and some sandpaper. And lastly, a strop. With those tools, you can take your knife and make it quite sharp. Adding additional stones or additional stropping materials, this is all stuff beyond the scope of an entry-level video. So I really hope that helps. Please post any questions to the forum, and it would be our pleasure to try to help you out. Thank you so much.